sure you take them off. All right, so we're going to start off. The integumentary system, as you guys know, is a system that sort of sets up a barrier and protects the body. On these models, the only one that I can really do is either the hair, which is pretty straightforward, or the skin. Now it also talks about like nails and things of that nature. You don't see any of these on these models, so I'm not going to be able to ask you that on a lab exam. But I could put a sticker anywhere on here and ask you, what is this, or what system is a part of. All right. The second one is the skeletal system. Okay. Now on the skeletal system, you have bones. So obviously we have any part here that I can put a sticker on. We're not going to do cartilage, tendons, and ligaments and joints, only because we're going to do that later in the laboratory. So really all I can do is put a sticker on one of these bone structures and ask you what part or what system is that part of. Teeth are not bone, right? So just make sure you know that so you don't kind of get confused. Muscular system talks about muscles which are attached to the skeleton. Again, any red muscle can be fair game for me to ask you, hey, what system is that part of? The one muscle that you're going to be asked to definitely identify by name is the diaphragm, which is located here and here. So this model, this thin layer below the lungs, same as this model, this thin layer below the lungs. Okay? If you move down to the nervous system, that includes the brain. So on both of these models, you're able to not only see the brain, you're also able to remove the brain out. All right? It talks about spinal cord, nerves, and the sensory receptors. Well, sensory receptors we can't identify, but on this model back here, you have this where you can identify the spinal area here, right? And then you have these spinal nerves. Okay, so you can actually have me pull this out and tell you, what is this, or these, or what system is this part? Okay, so that's sort of one of the hidden ones that I'm sure a lot of people didn't really pay attention to, but it is pretty straightforward. Hopefully you guys don't have too much trouble with that. If we go down the systems, the next one is the endocrine system. Here, the first one that's identified is a pituitary gland. So for this one, this brain doesn't come off, but this one does. So this is a model that I can easily use to tell you guys to identify the pituitary gland. And on here, there's like this yellow orangey pea structure here. That's the pituitary gland. All right, so that's part of the endocrine system. So that's something that I can definitely ask you guys, put a sticker on that and be what is that structure, or what system is that structure a part of? And that would be the pituitary gland. All right, bringing the model back up. If we go down the list for the endocrine system, we have the thymus. Neither one of these models have a thymus. The thymus will be found basically right center chest area, but it's only really mostly found in younger adults and children. Once you become an adult, that sort of regresses back and it's no longer there. Okay? But next on the list, you have the thyroid gland, which on this model is located here. On this model, you can barely make it out. It's this sort of glandular tissue right there. So these two structures be the thyroid gland. The parathyroid is not really identifiable on the models, although the parathyroid are like these 4 clusters that are found more dorsal to the thyroid. So if you look at a thyroid model, you can actually find 4 points of contact on the other side because these globular structures are found on the thyroid. The adrenal gland, well, for that, you would have to take some of this stuff apart. And as you guys recall from class, the adrenal glands sit right above the kidneys. So here's a kidney here, here's the adrenal gland, here's another adrenal gland. All right, on this model, it'd be the same thing. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to take out most of these things here so that we can observe the adrenal gland. And here, on this model, here's a kidney, so here's the adrenal gland. There's a kidney. This glandular stuff here would be the adrenal gland as well. Going down further on that list, you also have pineal glands, which you won't be able to identify. Then you have the ovary, the testes, and the pancreas. Now, the ovaries and testes are also not identifiable in these models because these are asexual. There's no male and female models, they're just asexual. But the pancreas is located here. Again, anything that's glandular has this like weird sort of cottage cheese looking component to it. So those are pancreas here and pancreas here, which is part of the endocrine system. Moving down the cardiovascular system, obviously that really includes the heart and a lot of these blood vessels. So on the heart, one of the things we talked about was being able to identify the inferior vena cava, which is a structure here which collects the blood from the lower part of the body, and the superior vena cava here, which collects the blood from the upper part of the body. But then the other structures that we talked about in class include the ascending aorta, which is the initial part of the aorta here, the aortic arch, and if you follow that to the back, that would be the descending aorta. Now this model shows it really nice. This model over here shows it, and in some cases I think it's a little bit better because the artery is thicker, but you have the ascending aorta here, the aortic arch, and then the descending aorta there located in the back area. Okay, but I could put a sticker on any one of these vessels here, anything that's either red or blue, and say what system is the structure a part of. All right, going down past the cardiovascular system, we have the lymphatic system. So this is the one that I think most people sort of like glimpsed over. Okay, on this list here it says lymphatic vessels. Now this model, kind of difficult to see, but on this model in particular, if you focus down here on the leg, these white vessels that you see here, those are lymphatic vessels. Okay, they're part of the lymphatic system, and so they're obviously colored different than the purple and the red, so they're distinguished between arteries and veins. But those lymphatic vessels are going to be collecting some of the fluid from the cardiovascular system. And then you have the lymph nodes. These little sort of bumps that you see here, these glandular components, are lymph nodes. Okay, on this model they're located here, and I believe on this model they're located there. You see these sort of little globular structures. Okay, so again, I think that system was one of the ones that most of you guys just completely glossed over when you guys were doing the lab the other day. Moving down the next, actually within the lymphatic system, aside from the lymph vessels and the lymph nodes, you have the spleen and the thymus. Again, the thymus is not going to be found on either one of these models, but the spleen is. So on both of these models, the spleen is located here on this model and located here on this model there. Okay. Now, after the lymphatic system, the next is the respiratory system. So now we're talking about the nasal canal, and on this model here, it's very visible. This area here is part of the nasal canal. Here you can also see the entry point of the nasal canal located there. All right, next down, the pharynx. On this model, this is the only one you can kind of see it. It's this area back here. All right, you can't see that on this model, but this area back here, that would be the pharynx. The larynx on both of these models are visible, although it's more visible on this model. That's what this is here. This is your voice box, contains your voice box. So this is the larynx here. On this model, you can barely make it out. It's this sort of white structure that you see there. All right, that would be the larynx. Moving on down after larynx, you have trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So again, on this model, here's the trachea. It leads down to the bronchi, which splits off into the right and left bronchi. All right. Here in this model, same thing. Here's the trachea. It leads down to the right and left bronchi, and then obviously you have your right and left lung, and right and left lung here, which are also here and here. Okay. Although we didn't learn this in class, I'm just gonna add this because I like to add stuff, right? When it branches off, each branch is subsequently addressed as the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and quaternary bronchi. But you guys don't have to know that necessarily for this exam. I just like to throw stuff, extra stuff in there for trivia night for you guys. All right. So once you get past the respiratory system, the digestive system is next. This is obviously a large one. We start with the oral cavity. Although I can probably maybe point to this area here, more than likely I'll probably use this model and say that this is part of the oral cavity, this sort of big orange structure there. That's your oral cavity. Next is the pharynx. As I mentioned, the pharynx can only be seen in this model, which is here. All right. Then the esophagus. On both of these models, the esophagus sits, or in fact, in your body, the esophagus sits behind the trachea. So you won't be able to see it where the trachea is, but once the bronchi split, this tube here, that's the esophagus, and this yellow tube here, that's the esophagus, right? And it's hidden until the bronchi split because it's protected from the bronchi. I'm sorry, it's protected from the trachea. So after you get past the esophagus, you have the stomach, which is pretty straightforward. Here's the stomach here on this model. There's where's the stomach? Here's the stomach here for this model. All right, that's pretty straightforward. Once you get past the stomach, you have the small and large intestines. All right, so in this model here, here's the small intestines. Here's the large intestine, which is also known as the colon. And I'll get back to that colon or that structure later. Small intestines, there's this yellow structure here, followed by the colon, which is around the edge, around the outside. Okay. Aside from the large and small intestines, you also have accessory structures like teeth. So obviously in this model I can identify that. All right. You also have salivary glands. And in this model in particular, you can actually see that. That's what this glandular tissue is here. That's a salivary gland. All right. And then you have the liver and the pancreas, which are accessory organs. So on both of these, the livers are pretty prominent. They usually hang out on the right side of your body. All right. And then you have the pancreas, which we've already identified before, so both of those are also part of the digestive system. All right. From the urinary system, you have the kidneys, which are located here, and you can barely see it on this model. It's that tiny little brown spot, although technically speaking on the test, I'm probably not going to be that critical and try to put a sticker on there because it's hard to see. Here you see the kidney there, and you see the kidney there. Okay. You also have the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. So if I remove this component and this component here, all right, following the kidney, you have this structure here and this structure here, which is the ureter. So this is a right and left ureter. Same as in this model, here's the right and left ureter. They both lead here to the urinary bladder, or in this case, down here to the urinary bladder, right? Now, on this model, it's not very visible, but if you take this model and you open the urinary bladder up in half, you'll be able to see the urethra, which is this canal that leads away from the urinary bladder, okay? So that's sort of a little hidden gem there for this model. So aside from those components, that really makes up the entire urinary system. Finally, the reproductive systems. Unfortunately, I can't ask you anything on these models because once again, these are asexual models, so there's nothing to identify, but just make sure you know the male system in terms of the cells, what they make, and all the components that comprise it. Same as for the female. Now, the other things that we talked about in class that are sort of important is, especially with this model here, this shows the greater omentum that we talked about. This is like this apron-like covering that holds all the intestines in the abdominal pelvic region in. Just kind of keeps everything in. Now, aside from that, the stuff that separates between all the organs that sort of forms a buffer zone and prevents any sort of abrasive results from organs kind of rubbing up against each other, those are called mesenteries. So when you look at some of these models, this white stuff up here, this white stuff here, you take the large and small intestine apart, the white stuff back here, and this white stuff here, and this white stuff back here, this is all mesentery, all right? So that's also something that I can ask you on an exam and be like, hey, what is this and what does it do, all right? We talked about the large intestine, and we talked about how it's also referred to as the colon. So on this model here, you have the part that connects to the small intestine, which is located here. That's called the cecum. All right, here's your appendix, just so you know. But here's your cecum, that's the initial portion. This is the ascending colon. Here's the transverse colon, and here's the descending colon. So it would sit like this on the model. So ascending, transverse, descending. You turn this upside down, and you have this weird sort of S-shaped part of the colon. That's called the sigmoid colon. So remember S, sigmoid. And then this part here is the rectum. And the last part here would be the anus. So this is the rectum, this would be the anus. And the same can be said for this model over here. You have the cecum, right? This little door opens up. We have the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and then here, the sigmoid colon kind of goes back into the back end of this model, and you can't see the rectum and you cannot see the anus on this model, all right? So for the most part, that comprises all the different structures that we kind of went over. But again, as I was telling some of the other students, those are all the structures, but remember, you also have to identify which systems they belong to. So I could put a sticker on any one of these, like here, and say, what system does this structure belong to? What system does this structure belong to? What system does this structure belong to? You know, what system does that structure belong to? So identifying which organs are in which systems is also important.